Hi everyone, welcome back to Season 3, Episode 7 of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. Today's guest is Elena Mutonono. Elena is a seasoned business coach who helps online language teachers move beyond one-to-one lessons and create a smarter system that lets them teach on their own terms and guarantees a stable income. Elena is the author and co-author of 6 books, the creator of several online courses, and the hostess in the Smart Teachers Library.
Hey everyone, buckle up for a new episode of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast, the one and only podcast made to help you launch your business or take your existing business to a level of success you could never have imagined. Whether you're a school owner, freelancer, publisher, or other entrepreneur, you're sure to pick up lots of actionable advice when you listen to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. Remember to visit eflmagazine.com for great articles and features. Without further ado, here's your host, the founder of EFL Magazine, Philip Pound.
Okay, great. Welcome back, everybody, to the latest episode of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. And today's guest is Elena Mutonono. How did I do with the name?
I think you did very well.
Thank you. It's not so easy, and it's beautiful to say, actually. And Elena is a coach for English online teachers.
Yeah,
not just English teachers.
Yeah, just language, any language teachers. Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Elena is originally from Ukraine and is now living in New Orleans. Is that right? New Orleans? What's the right way?
Yes, depends on who's talking. If you're talking to the locals here, it's New Orleans. If you're talking about people, or actually New Orleans. But if anywhere else in the US, it can be New Orleans or New Orleans. I think generally people in Europe call it New Orleans, so sound more French, I guess.
Yeah, I the Americans and French, they say homage, or more British English speakers say homage, but then they say the name Louis, St. Louis, but they don't say St. Louis, do they? Do they say St. Louis?
No, they never do.
Sounds strange, but they say Louis for the name, don't they?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I don't know. We won't go into that. But tell me a little bit about how you ended up in New Orleans, or
Oh, yes. How long of a story do you want? I will try to keep it brief. So yes, I spent most of my life in Ukraine, teaching English at a college, and I taught EFL. If we're using the traditional lingo, and then I was dating a guy from college that I had gone to in the US to get my advanced degree. And then we got married and I moved to the US. Now, he is from Zimbabwe, but he was also an exchange student at the college that I went to. So that's how we met. And that's how I ended up in a place that I had never been to and probably would not have chosen for myself, but it's a pretty unique place for the United States. And it's a nice place to be right now, because it's probably the warmest, well, not the warmest, but pretty warm for the United States.
Yeah. So when I think most people, when they hear of New Orleans, they think of a number of things, isn't it? Jazz,
right?
Gumbo, like they think of like movies like what was it, Angel Hearts? Isn't that right? So is it very much like that? And tell me about living after Hurricane Katrina. How things have
actually even Hurricane Ida. Because very recently, that was in actually exactly 16 years following Hurricane Katrina, Ida hit not New Orleans, New Orleans also, but on the same day, which is really, really weird. But yeah, I mean, New Orleans really has its own culture, as people like to say, whatever that means, but it's quite different from your generic American city where life is quite predictable and very business as usual. New Orleans is more let the good times roll, parades. Now we're hitting the parade season. Mardi Gras, which is a Fat Tuesday before the Catholic Lent, which, because it's predominantly Catholic place, Mardi Gras is pretty big, and celebration of Fat Tuesday is kind of the climax of it all. And the best thing, I guess, about New Orleans is the food. I think now that I've lived here 12 years, anywhere I go, I will miss the food. And not necessarily the local food, because I'm not a big fan of the jambalaya I guess jambalaya, red beans and rice, and gumbo. Those are nice things, but just the variety and how good restaurants actually have to be in order to thrive in New Orleans. Like you can't just, you can be a hole in the wall, but you have to have good food. Like it doesn't matter what you look like, but the food has to be good. Restaurants do not survive if they don't have good food.
It's kind of similar here in Tokyo. Even if you go to like a family restaurant or just very, very, very cheap chain restaurant, the food is always excellent.
Yeah,
there's no bad food.
Right.
Well, I mean, there are obviously some places I don't go or are maybe infamous, but generally the food is excellent here, and so it's the same in New Orleans.
Yes,
even
very,
cheap,
very much.
yeah.
Yes, very, like you have a tiny little shop where there's just a couple of people working, and the food is great. And of course, around the season of Mardi Gras, which is where we are right now, the parades. That's the best place and time to be at restaurants because they are making the best food, and so it's a really unique place. And on the flip side, I had a bigger culture shock going to other places in the US, for example, like Kentucky or North Carolina, or somewhere out in the West, like Idaho and others. This place is less orderly. And in that, it kind of reminds me, that plus, unfortunately, corruption, kind of reminds me of being back in Ukraine. So I don't always feel that big of a culture shock. I think the locals kind of like, oh, what is this? And I know that too, that it's not just my feeling, because some of my friends that come from out of state and stay here for a few weeks, either for Mardi Gras or others, they do notice that. But they like that part about it, that it's so kind of messy and so loud, and you can be whatever you want to be and you're never judged. And that is true. Very welcoming of artistic communities, very welcoming of any expression. But for people that enjoy order and business as usual, that is probably not the most exciting place.
Okay, and so you mentioned Ukraine, and that's where you come from originally. But
Yep.
now we're talking here on the 22nd of February, 2022, and unfortunately, things are happening in and around, and as we speak, I think over the past day, there's been further announcements by certain presidents. So what's your would you like to make any comments on what's happening in Ukraine?
I am not really knowledgeable to talk much about it. I know that this situation has been happening, however, since 2014. And that actually was something that moved me away from the Russian speaking market, because when I moved to the US in 2010, I was working primarily as an EFL teacher still, and most of my clientele was from Ukraine and Russia. But in 2014, when Crimea, where I actually am from, was annexed and the war started in the east of Ukraine, even though the governments were not announcing that publicly. And migration followed and inflation. As a result, I lost about 90% of my business. I mean, I just had a handful of clients that were working for international companies that were able to pay the fees because of how they were paid. They were not like dependent on the Russian ruble. That actually the inflation really hit it. So I worked with them for a short period of time, and then I just realized that I had to do something. And that's how in 2014 I decided to switch to a more global audience and work with teachers, begin working with teachers. And because for a short time I was doing accent training as well. But all of it was done for the English speaking audience. And I switched from using Russian in my marketing to using English. That was a very big step into the unknown. And so what's happening currently, it's of course very alarming. And I have family and friends there. So it's hard to see that. And I think it's hard on everybody, because we always think, oh, that's somewhere out there. It's not going to touch me in any way, but it always touches us in one way or another.
Yeah. It certainly hits home when family are involved.
Oh, yes.
And and it's the uncertainty as well.
Yes, yes.
I actually know what's going to happen, but who knows?
Yeah, the anxiety that comes with it. Yeah, it definitely is. But it is a good reminder for me that all we have is really what we have right now, and the ability to have conversations and connect with people. That's actually a big gift that we have. That after everything's stripped away, that's what we have.
Yes, exactly, and that's the freedom that we have in the West, and certainly certain countries. And I think your husband would have known growing up in Zimbabwe about inflation. And
oh yes, and I actually experienced some of it when I went to visit his family in 2007, and it was a little reminiscent of what I went through in the 1990s when Ukraine became independent, the Soviet Union had fallen apart, and that was kind of a really uncertain time. I was, of course, very young, so I couldn't really process things. But it's very interesting how your parents' fears and anxieties, when they're not shared, they kind of make an imprint on you. And so it's interesting that you grow up with some of those fears of what's going to happen. On the one hand, you are sort of more resilient because you've seen it happen. But on the other hand, you can't. It's almost like whenever there's a point of stability, you feel like you don't deserve it. And so that's the double-edged sword.
But then again, I suppose on the other end, for people that have grown up with stability, when periods of instability comes,
yes.
they're like COVID and
Mhm.
financial crisis and things like that. So I know this is an area that you really are interested in, is mental health. So
Yes.
how were you able to cope with your background and your husband's background when, the uncertainty came with
Yeah.
COVID? Was it
Yeah.
an advantage?
Um, some of it, and I think providentially, prior to COVID, in my business, I had made a decision that I want to spend more time and invest more time and money into my mental health. And that was very interesting because I started that journey at the beginning of 2020 when we really knew very little about COVID. And still at the time, it still felt like, oh, it's so far away. What's going to happen? And so I started working with a mental health professional, with a therapist, but primarily for one area of my life, which is motherhood and trying to be a better mom, and working through some of the issues from the past that come back and recur. And it was just very interesting for me to get to know myself that way. And I was also working with a coach, but business coach, but building that support system uh, was kind of, like I said, providential, because a few months into, when things started kind of falling apart, I knew who to go to. And that is, that was a great asset for me. Because we sometimes, especially when we teach online, we don't think about these things. We just kind of, well, I'm online, I can do everything. And particularly the story that we hear from many self-made, so-called self-made business people online, teachers, whether teachers or trainers or business coaches, whatever. And what they tell us is you can do it on your own. And I think COVID has shown to all of us that we really cannot, that we're really interconnected, and that events in the world and what's happening is really making a great impact on us and our mental health. So I think having that in place, and a little did I know that during COVID, a lot of other, kind of like all the hell broke loose, and a lot of other situations in life and personal and business, initial shock, like for everybody. um, and But I was really thankful to have that support system. I had people to go to and talk to, and that was a huge asset. And so did my husband, because he also felt the need to do that. And so through that, we actually really grew a lot, and learned, with the help of the professionals, to tap into our resilience and to kind of grow it. Not that it was easy, but I think without it, having to homeschool the kids, having to run the business, doing work. My husband's flexible, so he was also working from home, but it required a lot of adjustment. And so I'm really thankful that we had that. And I think that's something that I am now, when I'm working with teachers, I'm asking them, well, what is your support system? Where do you go? And I'm asking myself that as well. Like, where do I go? What do I need right now? Do I need a group of people to talk to? Do I need one person to talk to? Do I need to be connected, stay connected, and make an effort to stay connected with my friends? Because we sometimes feel like, oh, relationships, they will just come to us. But really, when we're older, we really need to be intentional about not just working with mental health professionals and coaches, but also even meeting with friends. Because when that was taken away, we couldn't go to cafes and have casual chats. We even locally we had to schedule Zoom meetings, So that's really, really important.
And some people did thrive in difficult situations,
It did. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there was a joke going around that if COVID hasn't affected your life so much, you had a boring life to
Right,
begin
exactly.
with.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's
So
true.
yeah, and some people are more introverted, more quiet, and
Hmm.
it's not such a thing, and
Yep.
they can put up with it a lot better. So I just wanted to dial back. That's really nice to share that, Elena, your experience. But
Mm.
I want to go back to the beginning of your business. So
Mm.
you arrived in the US and uh, you decided to become a coach for online teachers. So
Mm.
what year was this, and where was the market at this stage?
Yeah.
This was obviously before all the Chinese stuff happened, and
Right.
yeah.
Yes. So initially, like I said, I was working as an EFL teacher. And I sourced all of my one-to-one clients from um, private lessons and private referrals. So even though I was trying to learn how social media worked, one, I did not have the time to really understand it. And two, I just felt like it wasn't necessary because I had enough referrals to kind of last me. Now, it became a problem when several years into it, I felt like, well, if I want to take a break, I can't stop this thing. Yeah, I have to still teach online. And then it happened. So I had a child, and then I had to figure out like how am I going to continue being paid? And that was a big challenge because you can't just all of a sudden stop everything, create a course, and generate sales because there's a lot more work that goes into it than people say. And so I had to figure out different ways of working online and work through my own, I guess, mindset limits. And the first big challenge was to move away from a really generic market um, in 2014 to choose to work within a niche. So I decided I'm going to help online teachers because that was my passion. I had really enjoyed working with teachers, language teachers all the time, and I had done training even before that. But because I wasn't sure if it was going to work, I had another niche that I was working on that was accent training. So I had to completely sort of rethink what I was doing and how I was doing it. Um, and at the time, um, the market for online teachers, I mean, most of the teachers were working on italki and other platforms. But people really were curious about how can you do it on your own. And so I began writing in my blog about, different ways of how you could branch out and actually be your own boss. And that was an interesting experience because I got to meet a lot of people through LinkedIn groups, which existed at the time, no longer
Sorry,
exist.
the groups don't exist, or
Well,
yeah.
they're not as active as they used to be.
Oh,
So on
what do you put
LinkedIn.
that down to? Is it because other platforms have taken over, or
Yeah, I think
yeah?
so. And LinkedIn, I think, has changed too. I'm no longer on LinkedIn, but from the people that I've worked with that are working on LinkedIn, they say that has changed a lot. So there's more discussion happening on your own account and through direct messaging rather than groups. So, but at the time, this interaction within groups really helped me learn more about my ideal client, who they are, and arrive to the idea that, I'm not just working with any online language teacher. I'm working with people that are specifically like me, like I used to be, struggling with their overwork and burnout because they're teaching too many clients. They can't say no, because if they say no, they're afraid that tomorrow is not guaranteed. They may not have clients. So they're trying to cram as much work as they can. In the process, they burn out and they get sick. And of course, when they get sick, they can't generate any income. And so it was very interesting for me because I was working with the people and writing, eventually started to write for those people to help them find different ways of teaching online, and not just your very well-known story of, hey, if you are teaching 7 to 10 hours a day one-to-one, online course is your answer. It just doesn't work. I mean, it probably works for like very, very few people, but it doesn't work for the majority of people. And people that are listening today, if you tried it, if you worked 10 hours a day and taught English or whatever language one-to-one, and then you tried to create a course that didn't sell, you are not the only one.
Yeah, and coming on to that, working 10 hours a day, how sustainable is that?
It is absolutely not sustainable. Actually, according to an article, which I can send you the link to, if you do, well, I'm sure you can find it, research on Google, but if you do any kind of emotional type labor, or like that involves a lot of mental work, that 4 hours a day is your maximum. 4 hours a day. And, if you're talking about running an online teaching business, that's not just working one-to-one, right? Because you also are working on a podcast, or maybe you're writing, or you're creating a magazine, or you're trying to create a product. So it's more, usually it's more than 4 hours. And my idea was, well, how do we get to that point where we can actually move to at least working 4 hours and be sustainable? How is it possible? But because adding another client in theory sounds like a good idea if we were all machines. But that's where another law of economics kicks in, the law of diminishing returns. So at a certain point, you can no longer keep adding input and get more output. The machine breaks. That's where we burn out, and that's where we realize that what we're doing is unsustainable. For the first time I heard about this idea, I was on LinkedIn forum, and that was back in 2014 when I was still trying to figure out, what am I going to do now that 90% of my business is lost? I need to somehow come up with whatever. And somebody in a LinkedIn forum who was not a teacher said, maybe he was a teacher, but he said that one-to-one lessons or Skype lessons are a dead end street. And I got so mad reading it. I was like, what do you mean? But I really was in denial, because here I was in 2014, 95% of my business is gone due to an economic inflation. And there's nothing I can do, because my entire 4 years prior to that were all evolving around these, a maximum of 30 clients that I had worked with one-to-one with some of them for several years, because, you start at a lower level and you work with them until they get fluent, and you kind of become one big family. But the problem is you have not reached beyond it. And so now that everybody's gone, even if all of these people buy your online course, it's not going to make anything sustainable.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something that a lot of people feel is they're sold courses on how to make courses. Isn't that right? I talked about this.
Yeah.
And then if it doesn't succeed, then it was your own fault, because other people, it succeeded for other people, everybody else. So, ultimately you have the guilt, the shame, the regret, don't you? It's
yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
That's that's how it works. It works as a kind of a cult or religion sometimes. I think some
Yeah.
marketing is so closely related, isn't it? And comes
Yeah,
from a lot of
you
places.
feel like well, it depends on the marketing too and how we define it, which is another interesting thing to chat about. But really, when one story prevails, right? And the reason it prevails is because the person that tells the story has enough resources to keep telling the story and reinvesting money to tell the story. So you do not hear the story of how it really happened, right? You do not know if this person has been in business for 20 years and now they just sold a course and they made so much money, and cropped out and edited conveniently all the pieces of the story that are actually really formative pieces like failure. And now they create this embellished story to sell you the dream, and you buy the dream, but you don't get the dream. Why? Because of the edited pieces that lead to the dream. And that's a really intricate point for many teachers. They found that they're really vulnerable because when you're burned out. I remember it's kind of very close to when I had my first child, and he at some point he went through like this period where he was not sleeping well, and you are sleep deprived and you're willing to pay anybody any money to tell you how to put this child to sleep. um and the same thing, like if you are burnt out as a teacher and if you work morning till night, you don't think rational anymore, particularly if you're working with, some companies, here in the US, some companies in China, and you work through the night. So it's not just unsustainable, but it's also really unhealthy, breaking your circadian rhythms and so forth. And then somebody comes over and tells you, hey, like, we can give you something. We can teach you how to create a course and forget about all your sleepless nights. Of course, people are going to buy this. But what comes with that is when they don't get results, which they won't, for the most part, they won't. They will not immediately replace their income with online courses. The first online course, that was another thing that I heard in the very beginning that made me mad. But the first product you create, the first course you create is going to end up in a trash can or waste bin, whatever you call it. It's going to be tossed. It's not going to work, the first one. Maybe the second one either. Maybe the third iteration, fourth, will be somewhat workable. And then you hit a wall and then you'll have to rework it. And on it goes. But nobody talks about this, and because of that, we become victims, or this victim mentality is kind of enforced on us. And victim mentality, what is it? It's like, oh, I cannot change anything. This is all I have. Nothing's going to get better. But it's not true. But that's what happens. If somebody feeds you the story that you're going to get the dream, you buy the course, you go through the course diligently, you work on every assignment, and then you don't sell what they tell you. Some people tell you they sold as many courses that allowed them to take a vacation and not do any work anymore, or not do one-to-one anymore. But it's not true.
Yeah, and it is very much like a particular religion I'm thinking of. I'm not going to mention, but and you strive for perfection, and because there are so many measures for perfection, it's unattainable. And once it's unattainable, you go into the guilt and shame cycle, and you want to try harder. So that's very much like courses, isn't it? It always comes back on the person, and then you have to try harder. So you have to buy another course. And maybe that course didn't work because you didn't pay enough. So you have to get over to the next tier.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, and it just literally makes you like get into this system where and sometimes people, because of the perfectionism, that's a lot of like mindset work as well, because perfection is, well, often as teachers we have a different take on our work, so teachers receive a teacher's plan or work on a teacher's plan. They go in, they do a lesson, they evaluate, and for the most part, the better you're prepared, the better your lesson is going to go, if you have a little bit of experience. But with business, you have to fail and be willing to fail a lot, because once you fail, the more you fail, the more you discover what doesn't work, which is something that perfectionism keeps you from, right? Trying and making mistakes. So our resistance to failure, our resistance to change, our resistance to messes, because it's going to be messy, our resistance to doing things now as opposed to waiting for a better moment, and on it goes. So a lot of things about business is also about changing our mindset. So if I buy a course that teaches me, well, you go from A to Z and you have a course in the end, but does not teach me that I need to, how to work through my own perfectionism, which is fear of judgment, really, how to embrace the idea that you need to be able and willing to be judged, because that's what's going to happen if you go online. How to embrace the idea that it's never going to get perfect. Like it's never going, it will always be this kind of, oh, now we need to change this. Now we need to change that. You change this part of your website, then you need to change the other part of the website, and on it goes.
So, fascinating stuff about courses. So I wanted to move on about online teaching and moving from, these, what would we say, bulk offers, or these larger operators in the market.
Yeah.
And you mentioned before the podcast about commodification.
Right.
And you did touch a little bit also about, distinguishing yourself and having a niche. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
So really what happened for me personally, and that's how that evolved then into coaching as well that I do. But what happened for me is when I realized that in order to change anything about the way I worked, I had to say no to some people. And that was one big mindset block for me, because for me, qualification and being qualified meant you can help anybody. And that comes from the background of teaching at a college, where the more hats you can wear, the greater of an asset you are. But in the online world, surprisingly, the more you can say no to some people, the better loyalty you will build with others. So niching and this ability to say no to some people and yes to others is what really helps you to start on this journey of moving away from being just another teacher who charges X amount of money, and being compared against others who charge less, to a teacher who is actually desired, like, or somebody that people really want to learn from. And in order to do that, niching is, I guess, kind of the first step. And niching really is a long-term process. But you need to also, I think, as online teachers, we need to move away from the mindset of a teacher that only thinks about, or like generally thinks that my job is to do lessons and do them well. But once you get into a business, your mindset has to be, my job is to to become a creator. So whether it's a podcast or a YouTube channel or something, you cease to become the regurgitator of somebody else's things, somebody else's textbooks, and you create your own stuff. And that is a big step into an online business where you are building your own assets, essentially. So in my case, it was writing a blog and trying out different things. I actually can't say that. I think I stuck with blogging for a while because I had little kids, and recording was a big issue, and video recording was almost no issue because it would have taken me forever to put myself together. So like writing was the easiest thing to do logistically for me. But I had tried different other venues. And so once you put yourself out there, then people notice you and they want to hear more from you. And then they want to contact you, whether for lessons or for, to buy your product and so forth. But it doesn't happen where you just created a website. Now you're sitting there and waiting for people to come knocking on your door.
Tell me about it. Yeah.
Yes. Right. So you put yourself out there. Yes. Through the content that you create.
So we talk about commodification. So it all comes into differentiating yourself from your competition, right. And also value for what you offer, isn't it? Unique value, rather than being just a bland, generic product out there,
and then you're competing against so many other people and competing only on one point, which is price, which is you're never going to win because there will always be somebody who is cheaper.
Exactly. And that was anticipating my next move here, which was price. So it's about thinking more of yourself and your product and your offering and putting your offering, in front of the potential client, student. So you talked about working smarter and knowing your worth. So this is something I touched on with James Liu a few weeks back, and he has some students who are charged. Well, he's pretty upfront, and it's on his website, so I'm not giving away any secrets here. That they're charging maybe $100 an hour, whereas previously they were getting maybe $10. Or I saw, I think, a couple of weeks back, there was a certain school in certain part of East Asia, in as vague as possible, and they were offering teachers $4 an hour.
Yeah, and that's really sad. That's sad. And by creating offers and trying to fit yourself into the market that charges less and less, we are creating perfect environment for more of this commoditization. And so if we want a more just and equitable world, even among online language teachers, my role is to help people, to help the underdog, people that feel like, oh, I will never be able to charge more than $5 an hour, to teach them how to do it in different ways, because there are different creative ways, which I'm going to talk about too. But it's really important for us to keep that in mind, that unsustainable pricing perpetuates this inequality and perpetuates commoditization of our industry, which is something that we can only do if we work a little smarter about, and we go about smarter when it comes to pricing. But the idea of pricing, like you were saying, here's somebody who is charging $100 an hour. And initially, when I was at some forum a few months ago, and the person was saying, oh, I really want to charge more, can you know of anybody who can, pay me more? And and they were like, well, what is the price? What do you charge? And I said, well, you can charge anything between the tiniest amount and, three figures an hour. And he says, well, I want to sign up for the platform that will pay me. Well, the platform doesn't pay you because the goal of the platform is to bring in more people that are willing to work for almost nothing, so the platform can get a cut. But once you become a creator, once you try to play the long game and stand out, then you can call the shots because there's nobody there. I remember when initially, I think on italki, because I never really taught on italki, but I think I did create a profile for some time and just to see how it worked. And I realized that they encourage you to set a certain price. Encourage. So in other words, they have an earnings ceiling. And anytime you want to say, okay, I want to get a higher amount, they will tell you, oh, well, you don't have any reviews, you don't have any bookings, you need to start low, which is probably a good idea. But the thing is, that's how they teach you to really be cheap, like initially. And then once you are used to being paid lower than the average, then it's very hard for you to get back to, being paid even something that's, close to your living wages. And so the cycle continues. So one of the things that I do in the work with teachers, other than telling them, oh, you charge $20 an hour and you need to like increase it to 50. Some people can do it, and some people actually should do it because like if your living expenses are too low, you need to at least like make some effort upfront and say, okay, I'm no longer teaching for $20 on italki. I want to teach at 30 and try to stick with it. As a matter of fact, I was working with a teacher last week, and she was charging like 20 or 15 or 20 euros, whereas she felt like she had to charge about 40 or 50. And again, on a big platform. And I said, well, you have two options. You can move to a tiny little town that has nothing, and then your expenses will be small and you can continue working at this price, or you can actually increase your price. And one of the things that she did was a bold step, was to write to all of her clients and say, I'm leaving this platform and I'm going to work on my own. But in order to do that, I need to adjust my prices. And so she adjusted her prices, essentially doubled them. And she was shocked that most of her clients said, yeah, we want to ditch the platform and follow you.
Really? I thought there would have been a non-compete clause there. No.
Yeah. Well, she said she was leaving.
Ah, okay.
And so it was kind of like, you can stay on the platform, but I'm just letting you know that I'm no longer going to teach you.
Gotcha.
But this is what I'm going to do. And so no, she was just kind of transparent with them. But I think one of the ways that you can do that when you are your own creator and you just had your own, you feel like, oh, I worked on italki for this amount, now I want to work on my own for that amount. But it's hard. So instead of like adjusting your price, one of the things you can do also is adjusting the format that you're teaching. And that is something that you cannot and will not be able to do when you're on italki, because or any other platform. It just works by the hour. You can't change anything. So when you leave and you start calling your own, calling your shots and like, okay, this is how I want to do it. You can charge, for example, instead of charging $100 for 4 lessons or 5 lessons, you can charge $100 for a kind of blended type of a package where you only have 2 lessons and then maybe 3 assignments with feedback, but without the actual screen time. And they are called asynchronous assignments. So whether it's a speaking activity or a writing activity, you don't have to be in front of the computer at the same time. It's good for the student because it makes that flexible. It's good for you too, because you can give them an assignment, they do the task, and when you review the task, you usually, if the assignment is done right, you do not spend as much as an hour per assignment. You can do it much faster, especially if you you make your task really small, which is desirable because you don't want to overwhelm your client. So this is one thing to do. For example, if you leave a platform and then you're saying, okay, I can't be charging, $25 an hour. I want more. So one of the first things to do is change things around. Yes, you will still charge $100 per client, but you will not be working, for example, 4 or 5 hours, but you will be working maybe 2 hours or 3 hours. So it's different. And then you can even shrink your lessons, because I was shocked to hear that some teachers, I don't think they're on italki, but if they're working on their own, they say, well, I'm just going to have an online class for an hour and a half. So some teachers still do it. And you can shrink that. You can say, okay, I will still charge the same amount that I was charging, but my class is no longer going to be an hour and a half. It will be an hour. And then maybe from an hour, you go to 15 minutes, but you still charge the same amount. And for a client, it's the same budgeted amount a month. But for you, it's fewer hours. And you're training to be more of a coach and a mentor rather than a teacher with all the answers, or even a babysitter in front of the screen, which is what happens after like your clients and you get used to only online classes. They feel like that's the only way, and it feels so safe, both for teacher and student, that they can never let go and try out something different. But when you try things out, you have a great opportunity to learn how to charge in a creative way. So you're no longer charging per hour like platforms do, but you're charging for the value that you provide, for the guidance you provide, for the feedback you provide. And then it no longer matters if it took you 5 minutes to provide the feedback or an hour. It's kind of like that story with Picasso where...
I was thinking exactly the same thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Go
on. Yes, remember that story? Like it took him 15 minutes, and you were charging $5,000, but it took you 15 minutes. Well, no, it took me all these years to be able to do it in 15 minutes.
Exactly.
So, and I think teachers sometimes, because of the platform policy behind it, and because of the constricted and limited possibilities, and because of overwork that happens as a result of it and underpricing, teachers no longer can think creatively, but teachers are creative. And working smarter does not necessarily mean now I'm going to just stop one-to-one, create a course, and wait for my millions to come in. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be in a small way where you leave the platform after you have prepared for it. Like, don't leave the platform today as you're listening to it. Give yourself a 6-month period where you focus your account, adjust your price if needed, spend more time thinking about your strategy, and also build enough savings so that you can say, I'm leaving. Some people will say, okay, bye, I'm going to look for somebody else. But I can guarantee you, if you're any good, some people will be like, I don't want to spend another 5 months looking for a teacher. Can I work with you? Because that's their choice they're making. So prepare for it. And when you leave, you don't need to recreate italki on your own website. You can be creative, even if you are still charging one client $100 a month, but it will be a different $100. It will be more flexible. It will be, in different ways. And then, as you free up more time and are able to strategize, you can go on social media and actually build a community and of people that will be interested in your offer. But that again takes time. We're going back to the story that we were talking about in the beginning. That's what people don't tell us, that it really takes a lot of time and mindset shifts. But it's totally worth it. That's why we got into online teaching to begin with. But then we put ourselves into a situation where we can no longer be creative.
Yeah, exactly. So just to kind of sum up, it was some fantastic takeaways there, Elena. So basically what you want to do is you want to offer value that's not just client facing or FaceTime with the client.
Absolutely,
you want to offer
yes.
more value, as you say, feedback or asynchronous learning.
Yes.
And it's about the incremental gains for you in your time, isn't it? So
Yes.
it's like rather than teaching, an hour, maybe 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and that's shaving off 10
That
minutes.
that is a big step, first step. And that's the most surprising when I work with teachers. Like, you can start making more tomorrow by writing to your clients and say, no more 60-minute lessons. I have 45 minutes, and they are going to be the same amount. Now, if you really miss 60 minutes, they're going to be more expensive. And I can guarantee you, everybody will say yes to 45 minutes because those 15 minutes, your brain is not there anymore.
Yeah, and our lesson one-to-one is quite hard anyway, isn't it? I mean, for the
It is.
student, I mean, I don't know about you, but it depends, of course, on the student. But I think teaching is easier for an hour than being a student.
Yeah.
It's
Yes. Well,
it's tough.
especially considering that a lot of them are adult clients that start working on their, English after work, and they already have their brain, all gone by then. So I think it's only good for us to offer something that's less time consuming for them.
Exactly. And what I found is recently with the race to the bottom, commodification, the cheapening of the offer and the market is that, it's been in ELT, EFL for many years, the native, non-native speaker thing, hasn't it?
Yes.
And that's been there. But what I found is that a lot of companies have kind of hijacked this issue as a reason to pay non-natives less, isn't it? It's like, we're like super diverse and welcoming.
Right,
it doesn't matter. But actually here you get your $5 an hour. Have you found that as well? Is that's
yes, and also as well as how that impacts teachers that have experienced that kind of, I would call it abuse, because that's what it is really. And when they come out of it, which is kind of they undergo a certain trauma, coming out of it and starting your own business, you will be dealing a lot with the repercussions of that kind of treatment. You may no longer have a person paying you $5 an hour, but you will feel like that's what you're worth. And that's the shocking thing about such kind of abusive treatment of non-native, whatever the label they slap on them, because then you feel like, well, I'm not worth it. And that is a really, I think, a huge challenge in our industry, really, that we need to address. And people, deal with that, like, because I work with, and I'm not a native English speaker, but, and I had my battles to fight also being an immigrant. So for teachers that are starting or going into the global market, they're like, well, who's going to pay me? Well, I can guarantee you there are quite a few people that will pay you. But because our mindset is already set a certain way, then we feel like, well, the only people that will want me are the ones that can pay me $5 an hour. And that's something that we need to actively work against.
Yeah, and I think it's educating the market as well,
Yes.
that you're not willing to be paid this amount. And if for example, I had a gentleman contact me, and he was by his own words, where he was an international businessman. He said, I'm looking for an English teacher. I think I like your profile. I was like, oh, okay. And he said, I'm willing to pay you $5 an hour.
Wow. Yeah.
So, I was like,
there you go. There you go. That's your decision making.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's it. So don't put up with it, and have your boundaries, isn't it?
Right. Exactly. You want to set it up. Yes, right away. And
you don't need these people. Yeah.
Finding that even if you're a non-native speaker, you actually have your own unique perspective that you bring that native speakers may not have, of learning the language that you're now teaching to the people that are struggling with it, because you have gone through the struggle. So that's a pretty important aspect that sometimes non-native speakers miss, that they're actually speaking the language, and that's the language that is so desirable to their audience as well.
Exactly. So it's from what you might think is a deficiency, but actually it's an advantage, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's something that you can offer. So I don't know much about learning Ukrainian or Russian or other Slavic languages, but for you, maybe you could say, these are the difficulties I had learning English,
right? Exactly.
grammar, and this is, whereas for me or for any other native speakers, we just wouldn't have that depth of knowledge whatsoever. Yeah.
Right.
So,
right.
That's the thing. So I'm talking to Elena Mutonono. I got it right twice. I think I'm getting very confident here. So your website, Elena, is Elena. I'm going to put the link in the show notes on elenamutonono.com. And what do you offer? Teachers, what's your offering for people who want to follow you or sign up for your coaching?
So I also have a podcast. It's called Online Bound, and where we are talking about what it's like moving into online teaching business and online space, and all the mindset things that we need to overcome as mindset blocks, and focusing more on the creative aspect of online teaching, and also dealing with the things that keep us where we are. So Online Bound, find me wherever you're listening to podcasts. And I've got a blog that you can read if you're into reading, if you're more into reading. If you're more committed, I've got several books, and you can all find them on the website. And a community for online language teachers who want to build their businesses the smart way. So there's plenty to explore.
Great. And there's some really great takeaways today about knowing your worth, knowing your value, how to position yourself, and breaking free of abuse, as you said, and low wages, and moving forward, and being a success. So Elena, thanks again for agreeing to do the podcast. All the links will be in the show notes there. And
thank you so much, Philip.
See you next time.
Yes.
Thanks for listening to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast with Philip Pound. For more great advice and resources, check out eflmagazine.com. If you found this podcast helpful, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.